Plato's Republic. The Republic is probably one of the most famous dialogues within the history of philosophy, if not literature. It is a dialogue that deals with many themes that range over the entire scope of philosophy, but also politics and sociology. But its main question, or its central question, is the question of the nature of justice, a philosophical question. What is justice? In examining this, Plato does so through the notion of the perfect state. We have the concept of a utopia. For example, Thomas More has a book on that. And that concept is, in fact, central to other works, social and political works, as exemplified. So, as in most of Plato's dialogues, Socrates again serves as the main protagonist, but what we have moved out of the so-called Socratic dialogues and into views which are more representative of Plato. Of course, within this first book that we'll be examining, we won't see that as much as the argument will start to develop. But still, this particular dialogue does begin to sort of develop upon Plato's own particular ideas. And again, I urge you to watch the biographical video to see what Plato's ideas are. So the setting here is that Socrates is actually narrating a trip he took to the Piraeus, which is the port, an ancient shipping port, with his friend Glaucon. It's actually still a major port today. You can see a picture of it here, very beautiful at night. And from this port, you can sail off to all the various islands. A lot of tourists go in the summer, and they sail to the islands and enjoy their summer there, their vacation. So during this trip, he meets a friend, L05, who is an older philosopher, and probably older than Socrates at the time, because Socrates would have been a young man at the time. And he convinces them to rest at his house. In fact, what he wants is to have a conversation with Socrates, because even as a younger man, Socrates is known to be a great conversationalist and a philosopher. So this is just sort of setting up the stage, and it eventually moves into a discussion. And the discussion begins with an analysis of the nature of old age, and it's said, well, old age brings a lot of negative things. For example, you lose strength both in your body, your limbs, and in your mind. You're prone to sickness and disease, and of course you're approaching death and all these other things. At this point, L05, who is an elderly man, rejects this idea, and he said, wait a minute, there are some benefits. And one of the benefits that he identifies is he says that when you're older, you're really no longer a slave to desire. This includes sexual desire, includes money. For example, if you have money, the rich person really who is well off is not so desirous of money as somebody who is poor and constantly seeking money. Of course, they're omitting the idea of greed there, but there's a certain aspect of that which might be the case. If you have a certain amount of comfortable money, you're not really worrying about it. And his idea is that when you're old, well, you don't have these lustful desires, and that just doesn't reduce to sexual desire, but it can be about ambitions and other things. You kind of reach the end of life, and you kind of just want to sit back and relax a bit. So the basic point here, the starting point, is that they're putting the discussion within the realm of the nature of virtue. And remember from the intro video, Plato's work is a moral theory that develops upon virtue ethics, the idea that good and evil, and good and wrong, good and bad, etc. I can't get that out of my mouth, are sort of the properties of a virtuous agent. And so when we talk about justice, we are talking about justice as such, but we are talking about a just person. And so we have justice, and we have courage, and we have greed as a vice in this particular case. And so what Plato wants to talk about is a particular virtue, which is called justice. And this opening discussion leads into that. From this, a definition, as is the procedure we see in Plato, is given. And it is said, Polemarchus gives the definition that justice implies returning good to friends and harm to enemies. This is a very popular notion of justice, which is referred to as retributive justice or simply retribution. And we see the lex talionis, or law of retaliation, is sort of built into this. We have the code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so it's the idea that we're returning good for good, evil for evil. If someone murders, then they should be executed. If someone strikes an eye out, then they should have their own eye removed. Okay, and so Polemarchus is saying that this is what justice is. It's this kind of retaliation for receiving some sort of ill or returning good to friends, as he says. So a conversation ensues after that. I'm going to skip over that because really the discussion becomes interesting when this particular fellow, Thrasymachus, or the Greek pronunciation is Thrasymachus, but the English tongue says Thrasymachus, he barges into the conversation. You should really read that scene when he barges in. It's quite interesting. And he starts to belittle Socrates. And he says, Socrates, you always ask questions. You can imagine he's sort of a big and overbearing man, a sophist and kind of a politician too. And he says, you always ask questions, but you never give answers. And he demands of Socrates, and he calls him a fool as well, and all of them fools for their definitions that they're giving. And he says, I demand, give me a definition of justice without showing some benefit or self-interest that you derive from doing just deeds. And Socrates is kind of left dumbfounded. He says, look, you can't give a definition like that, and we'll see why that's the case later. So Thrasymachus, and why Socrates thinks that, from there, then, who's very eager to do so, provides his own definition. And he says, justice, what is justice? Is the benefit or self-interest, you could add advantage here, okay, I'll sort of bring these together in the discussion, of the stronger. So it's the strong, the powerful, it's their benefit. To be just, what is just is in their benefit. That's the nature of justice. And so he gives some evidence in support of his definition. Rulers enact laws for their own benefit and self-interest. And I think if we think of politicians today and how self-interested they can be, there's a certain truth to what he's saying. Does that mean that this is what justice is, or it's just what unjust persons are? Well, this is the question of the dialogue. But according to Thrasymachus, this is what justice is. And rulers who enact laws for their own benefit or self-interest, like the tyrant who subjugates the people, are just in doing so. Not only that, but they have the right to do so, because what is just is to seek one's own benefit or self-interest, and unjust to do otherwise. As we'll see in a bit, his whole argument is built upon an assumption, and we'll see what that assumption is. And it's actually, the assumption is itself a kind of moral theory. So Thrasymachus probably isn't aware of this, but his whole view about justice is based upon a certain moral theory that he has, which he doesn't actually explicitly discuss. Socrates naturally will object to this rather radical position, and he'll do so using the following analogy or position. He says, let's look at justice and see it as a kind of art or craft, and the word Greek here for craft is a techne, or technology. The way you can think about it is a carpenter, right? A carpenter has a craft. Okay, it's not so much an art, because in the sense of a fine art, it's a craft in the sense of the ability to build things, and the more fine and skilled the craftsman is, the better their art is. And he's saying that justice is like that, and the execution of justice is like that. You can have a fine craftsman who is skilled at justice. Notice the tie here, the connection to the notion of justice as a virtue. And we're going to see this when we turn to Aristotle later, because he's going to link this idea, notice justice, art, craft, okay, craftsmanship, enacting just deeds, to the notion of justice as a kind of skill and habit. We'll see that later. So this leads to the craftsman argument. Every craft seeks the benefit over that which it rules. So if you're a craftsman, you want to build a nice table. So you're not interested just in yourself. You can be, you want to sell it, but in the actual art, and a true artist is always concerned with the art itself. So they seek the benefit over their art. Justice is a craft. This is the assumption. Therefore, in conclusion, justice seeks the benefit over that which it rules. Okay, so notice how this is going to become an objection to the particular argument that Thrasymachus gives, that justice is about one's own self-interest. So here's the analysis. If a doctor is purely self-interested, so they have no interest in their patients whatsoever, they're just interested in money, eventually they will fail as a doctor. Their patients will remain sick or become worse, their treatment surgeries will fail, they're always trying to get money and have no interest in their patients. Inevitably, their patients will avoid them, and that doctor is going to go out of business. That's the idea. So, in like fashion, if we look at the opposite case, a just ruler seeks the benefit of his or her citizens. The ruler will enact laws that benefit not himself or herself, but the citizens over which they rule. And to do otherwise, as the bad doctor, would be to do harm to oneself. So, the just ruler is like a good doctor. They seek to benefit their citizens. The unjust ruler, like the bad doctor, in seeking to benefit him or herself, will eventually reap various negative consequences for their behavior. Notice how that kind of ties back to the definition of justice that Polemarchus gave, that justice is a kind of returning good to friends and harm to enemies. So we don't really talk about that here, but later on in the Republic it gets talked about, and it's shown that this is kind of what justice is, because there is a sense of returning to someone one's due, but this is not, retribution is not the way to go. And in fact, Aristotle has a much more developed argument, which we won't look at. Okay, so moving on, Thrasymachus responds, and he begins this particular procedure of looking at justice, which will be carried on in the second book. And it's called the injustice principle. And he says that the life of injustice is better than the life of justice. So think about that. We're talking about the unjust, the cruel, the wicked, that they live better lives than the just, the loving, right? So the question is why, though? And here is the assumption that was contained in his earlier statements. Everyone seeks their own self-interest and benefit. This is called moral egoism, or it's called egoism, actually, not moral egoism. It's moral egoism when you say that good and evil is based upon our own self-interest and benefit. So egoism, you should strike that out, is just everyone seeks their own self-interest and benefit. Moral egoism is that good and bad are depend upon our self-interest and benefit. So those who hate justice are simply too cowardly to do unjust deeds. So everyone seeks their own self-interest. The weak and the cowardly don't do unjust deeds because they're afraid of getting caught, right? And still more, they call the unjust man vicious and bad, but they're jealous of his success. I make a note here, CF, that means a note, to Nietzsche, because we're going to be looking at Nietzsche at some point in his genealogy. And we'll see that, well, Nietzsche's views about justice and injustice are kind of similar to that of Thrasymachus. All right? So, to the contrary, the unjust man outdoes everyone and everything. Just men are honest, but unjust men lie, cheat, and steal. Just men pay taxes. Unjust men don't, so they get away. They make more money. The unjust man who escapes justice. I'm sure that there are those unjust individuals in history who have perfectly escaped justice. They live a perfect life. So the tyrant and dictator who escapes justice, right, this kind of retribution, obtains everything that his or her heart desires because they can reap and they can steal and they never suffer for it.